Yeah, my apologies for an unexpected conflict requiring me to tape this. So we're now going to talk about the NIH review process. First, I'd like to give a special thanks for Tika Hall, who's given this talk in the past, and she was inspiration. And I've also adopted a couple of her slides, as well as acknowledge a resource called the Grantsmanship Review Process by Kirk and Martin. This is my conflicts. Probably my most relevant conflict is that I have been funded by the NIH for many years. So at the end of this session, I like to really have people feel comfortable with the peer review process, understand what a reviewer's job is, what are the core elements that the reviewer will evaluate your grants on, what you could do to avoid some common pitfalls and present your grant in a compelling way, and then understand really what the scoring system and critiques are all about. So what we want to do is demystify this process. Often, as this cartoon shows, the whole process can appear quite complicated with a good outcome really dependent on a miracle. But in fact, the process is very well defined, and I hope that after this session, you'll understand this. And with many things, the process will begin with you. And you can see on the left-hand side, it's the researcher and the researcher's idea that kicks everything off. But also what is important to know is that you are working from an institution, an academic medical center, a hospital, and so forth. And it's really your grants administrator that you need to work with to ensure that the grant gets submitted, the appropriate signatures get applied, and that the format is appropriate. Once the grant gets submitted by your institution, it goes to a center at the NIH called the Center for Scientific Review. There are a few exceptions, but that's generally where it goes. And the Center for Scientific Review will look at your application and make sure that it's intact. Page limits were adhered by, font limits were adhered by, and that there is really no violations. For example, some grants prohibit appendices. I actually had a grant sent back to me because there was a one-page appendix that was inappropriately inserted. So that's what the scientific review will do. Check the boxes, so to speak, and then assign it to a study section. Often the study section will be informed by information you actually provide in your cover letter or on a sort of an administrative form in the grant application. Now, the study section in green is really a group of reviewers who we'll talk about in a moment, who will be discussing your grant as well as potentially another 149 other grants, and make some scoring decisions that then get used by the Institute, for example, National Heart, Lung, Blood, or National Institute of Mental Health, and they will use your score to and percentile to determine whether your grant is going to be fundable by in terms of its priority score, as well as its alignment with the institute goals. And then those final funding decisions, which happen at the NIH with input by an advisory council, institute director, your project officer, will be made, and funds will be hopefully allocated to your institution, and your institution then makes those available for your research and career development. Now, just as a recap, keep in mind that the process is you generating a strong application, its receipt at the Center for Scientific Review, and then assignment to a study section, then assignment to specific reviewers, and then the reviewers who then go ahead and provide critiques and scores, and then those will again go to higher level NIH review, which we call an advisory council, and then project officer review and funding decision. So let's now dig deep. So when we used to meet in person, this is what a study section looked like. It was generally a group of about 30 people meeting in a hotel room, now often on Zoom. And they all, each reviewer is is usually assigned about 15 applications, and they may provide one of three roles. They may be the primary reviewer who summarizes briefly the application and really, gives a more detailed critique of the strengths and weaknesses, particularly the factors that drive their level of enthusiasm. And then there are secondary and tertiary reviewers who provide additional comments about strengths and weaknesses, potentially reinforcing the primary reviewer or providing additional points, either positive or negative. And then there's a whole set of discussions and scoring that we'll go into in a moment. So what a reviewer is asked to do when participating in a study section is really a few things. First of all, a set of reviewers is usually asked to participate in a study section that has a broad mandate. For example, I do sleep medicine epidemiology, and my grants often go to a study section that look at epidemiologic studies of sleep, cancer, and cardiovascular disease. So not everybody on that study section is going to be an expert or even be interested in sleep, but hopefully have some methodologic and other areas of interest, so they'll appreciate the discussion by those who are assigned the grant. A reviewer will get a list of grants a few months before the meeting, and to make sure that any potential conflicts of interest, for example, being from the same institution or sharing funding or having a personal relationship with the grantee, is identified, and those reviewers will be excluded from having any input into those grant critiques. Reviewers can get up to about 15 grants. That's a big workload, and they'll have a couple of months to review them. And then about 7 days before the meeting, they're asked to provide their written critiques following a very structured format into an online system. What's interesting is before they actually meet, there is actually a period after they submit their written critiques where they will also look at the written online critiques of the other two, the secondary, the tertiary reviewers, and have an opportunity to reflect on whether they missed anything or want to take a look at what was, their perspective of the grant. And they could actually update their comments and their initial scores as well. And then sometime before the meeting, the final initial scores are assigned. And based on those, the scientific review officer will identify the top 50 percentile of the most positively ranked grants to review, and the remainder essentially will be not discussed. Now, there's always an opportunity for a reviewer to protest and say, even though the score was below the 50th percentile, I think it would be useful to discuss. But in generally, the issue of whether your review is discussed or, so to speak, triaged, is made before the meeting. Now, again, as a reviewer, we hope, and the expectation is that our reviewers are fair and impartial, they're free of conflict of interest, and they basically focus on really identifying these structured criteria or which we'll go into, where they really look at as guideposts to summarize the strengths and weaknesses across a number of areas, and use those to assign specific scores and an overall score. And that they're not only doing this alone, but on the online pre-meeting interaction as well as at the meeting, they're listening closely to what their colleagues are also saying and really coming up with a fair and informed score. So that's what we hope. Now, the big factor is to make sure that your grant is read in a way that you like it to be read and that you're communicating clearly. And so keep in mind that, these reviewers all have full-time jobs, and they have 15 grants to read, and often they may open your grant 3 in the morning. And what they're going to often really, be when they're writing grants is feeling tired. They may or may not be an expert in your area. So your grant has to be appropriately written so that any reasonably smart person in this general area of science can follow what you're writing. The reviewer understands that there are many competing grants. They're never supposed to say something like, I think this should be funded or not funded. They're explicitly told, do not use the F word. But they intrinsically know that the highest scores are more likely, the best scores are more likely to be funded, and mediocre or poor scores aren't. And your job is to make sure that they are enthusiastic about your grant as they read it, and give it the highest score. So you just think about when you read a novel, you are enthusiastic about a novel if it reads clearly, if the grammar is good, if it tells a story that you could resonate with, and it's logical. And same thing with a grant. So you want to avoid confusing or annoying the reviewer. Make it easy to read because of using appropriate language, but also appropriate formatting with enough white space. Avoid surprises, meaning make your story logical. Don't have a set of aims that that then are not consistent with what you say you're going to do, where there will be a surprise. Oh, didn't know they were going to do that. And make sure that the whole grant talks to one another. Your research plan complements your career development plan, and so forth. And make sure that everything they're supposed to evaluate, which we'll go through, you address, from your career development plan through items such as sex as a biological variable, and we'll get into that. And give the reviewer words within your grants so that they could actually use those words in their own review, words to state the significance, the innovation, the strengths. And in fact, and keep in mind what the reviewers are going to do is they're often going to start with reading the abstract and specific aims. And that's why that's how you're going to make your first impression. And that's what we're going to discuss today as well. Make sure that they flow and are tight and cogent. They're also going to read through the grants. And again, as we'll talk about, after they get a feel for the grant as a whole, we'll rank the strengths and weaknesses of each of the criterion. So here are the criterion. We're going to focus on the training grants on the right, but very briefly, the non-training grants, or in this case, I'm going to refer to the R01 or the research grants, are scored slightly different than training grants. In the research grants, there is, you get a score on your significance, how important the question is, the innovation of your approach, the investigator, often productivity and skills in the area, the approach, which is essentially the research plan, and the environment. In the training grant, there's a different 5 set of criterion. There's and relatively in this order, in my opinion, first, the candidate, who you are, your career development plan, your research plan, your mentors, your environment. And you will get a score for each one of these, but then you will get an overall impact score. And the overall impact score is not a simple arithmetic mean. It really often is weighted differently. So in a research grant, often the approach is the driver, and the significance of the impact score. Whereas in a training grant, it's often the candidate and the career development plan, although all these elements do contribute. And in addition to those criterion, there are other areas that you'll have to attend to in submitting your application that are considered. They include your section on protection of human subjects, your inclusion criteria for children and minorities and women, protections of animals and biohazards, and if it's a resubmitted grants, your response to the original submission. There are other aspects, and there are other aspects too that have recently become part of the review criterion that may not have a specific section, but you're going to want to address in your approach, such as sex as a biological variable, the scientific premise of the, the research, the preliminary data that informed the research plan, the rigor and reproducibility of your methods, particularly for career development awards, your plans for conduct and responsible conduct of research, research sharing plans, and even the budget. Now, the budget's not supposed to be part of your score, but if it's inappropriate, it could influence the way the reviewers look at your grant. Now, reviewers will use a structured online template. And again, each of the criterion, they are asked to comment on strengths and weaknesses in bulleted format to really get to you, really the crux of what excited them and what concerned them. And then there is an overall impact paragraph too, that really briefly describes those strengths and weaknesses that drove their overall level of enthusiasm. And when you get this critique, it's really, really important to read this carefully. Now, the overall scores are assigned from a 1 to 9 scale, with 1 being the very top exceptional and 9 being the poor. Sometimes people get mixed up. I remember one reviewer who thought very good was really good and gave lots of 4s, but unfortunately 4s are not considered usually a fundable score. So there can be some confusion by reviewers, and hopefully the study section chair and scientific review officer can get everybody scoring using somewhat similar, hopefully similar scales. Now, one of the key things that I want to stress is you want your application to be written in a way that's received positively. That's part of the NIH review process. And one of the things you want to do is to make sure you get your grant in the door, getting it discussed, or not having it so quote unquote triaged. So you want people to be enthusiastic, like the woman in the middle who's saying, this is novel. And what you do not want is to people to say, too ambitious, fatal flaw, confusing, because it may not get in the door. So keep that in mind. And so in fact, if you can get your grant discussed, you will get not only the individual critiques, but you will get a summary of the whole discussion, which could be very, very informative to let you know really what bothered people and what excited people. Now, at the study section, once you get discussed, there's only about 20 minutes per application of discussion. And what generally happens is each of those 3 primary reviewers give an initial score so people understand their overall level of enthusiasm and how similar or disparate they are. If they're similar, the discussion usually goes pretty quickly. If they're very wide-ranging in their initial enthusiasm, the chair knows that they need to spend a little more time to try to understand those differences. Each of the reviewers provides a very brief summary of their impression of the grant, really emphasizing the drivers, what drove their level of enthusiasm or not. And then after they do the primary reviews do their discussion, it's open to the whole study section. Now, the whole study section often has only read the abstract or the aims, and that's why, again, we emphasize that those really need to sing, beautifully, because you want them to look at this, and you want people who didn't even read the whole grant to be in a position to say, hey, this is really important, or this is a really cool idea. So there's an open discussion, and then after some back and forth, the primary reviews are asked to review where their current level of enthusiasm or score is. And sometimes people go up and down a little bit based on that discussion. And then everybody is asked to provide a written score. And that's an overall score for the impact, and that often will be given a percentile depending on the funding mechanism. The career development grants are often just an absolute score, and that often determines funding. Now, we've gone through the process. Now let's just go through a bit of, some of the key elements, particularly for a training grant. So when again, they're going to look at one of the key criterion is you as a candidate, and they're going to really look at a few things you submit. Your narrative, which is part of the application, where you talk about what your training was, what your aspirations are and were, what you now plan to do, and where you want to go. Your story, your really embellished elevator pitch. They're going to also be looking at your bio sketch to see how productive you are and what your prior training is, and whether you are appropriate to do the proposed training and work at this point. And they will also look at the letters that three experts in the field really have given to make sure that independently others attest to your potential and skills. Now, another very important part is both the environment and the institutional commitment. Now, the environment is usually pretty straightforward. Do you have is the appropriate lab and office space, materials, data, mentors, intellectual environment appropriate? And that's usually addressed in a resource section. What's trickier is the institutional commitment, because in fact, you do need usually a letter from your department chair. And they usually need to say that the person, they love you, they think you're a great person, they will protect your time, and often that they will guarantee you a faculty position. And that could be a catch-22, because often department chairs don't want to write these letters until they know you have research funding. So there is a little bit of nuance and arm twisting, and definitely talk to your division chair and your mentors to make sure that you can get the strongest letter available, given the fact these can be challenging depending on what your current position actually is. Your career development plan will have, is a very, very important part. And they're going to look at criteria. And, here you're going to propose both mentored activities where your mentor or mentors provide direct apprenticeship-like training, as well as potentially didactic courses in methodologies and participation in seminars and so forth. And they're going to really say, do you need this training? And is this the right training for where you're going and your research plan? And you want all these sections, who you are, your training, your research, your future, to interdigitate and to really enhance one another, to complement one another. One of the key issues that comes up, sometimes you propose too much training and they think that that's going to distract you from actually doing the research, or you may not propose enough specific training in key gap areas. So this is a really important area, as well as the timetable for when you're going to do this training as it relates to your research. Now, mentors are an important part, and they're going to look at the qualifications of your mentors in terms of both their experience in successfully training other folks. They're going to have to list about, a description of who they've trained and what their current positions are, as well as their expertise in the area and their own relationship with you. And so again, here are things that will be evaluated from the mentor, and I summarized that already. And I just want to also say they'll also look at the mentor's funding, because often these career development grants are embedded in a larger research environment, and they want to see that the mentors have resources that will complement what the K grant or the career development grant will bring in. Now, the research plan is also an important component, maybe not as important as an R01, but again, it should be appropriate for your level of training. It should be the logical next step. And they're going to ask questions about, is it an important question? Is it, if it's a K23, is it patient-oriented research? If it's a K08 or K02, that's not so relevant. Is the plan really going to give you those experiential experiences, as well as the preliminary data for you to make your next step to an R01? And have you thought about power, safety, all kinds of other specific things related to your research plan? As I said, in career development plans, responsible conduct of research is very important. And at this point, it's very, they want at least 8 hours, of contact, and not just online, but also really small group and interactive, where in fact there's the whole scope of addressing conflicts of interest through handling misconduct and authorship. They also like to see faculty or mentors participate in the the responsible conduct of research as well. They like to see this at every career stage and at least every 4 years. Now, for time, I have these in my slides, but just to emphasize, the R grants are a little different. So in addition to what I said, the significance of the research is important. Is this really important to make important conceptual or content advances? Is this innovative? Is it novel? Is it timely? Is it relevant? Is there a new paradigm? Are the PIs and collaborators, do they have a history of working together and have the appropriate skills? And is the environment, appropriate, laboratories, et cetera? And in the R grant, the approach, which is the research plan, gets a lot more scrutiny about the rigor of the methodology, the sampling, the sample sizes, the validity of all the agents, and so forth. So although this is also relevant in the career development plan, it does not, obviously the career development plan research plan is much less ambitious, and they understand, or they should understand, that you're learning how to do research. So again, as I said, you will, after everything's scored, get an overall impact score. For R grants, you'll also be percentiled. So you'll be not only get an absolute score, but a percentile. And you will and again, you'll get a score that will range from 10 to 90. So those 1 to 9s get multiplied by 10. And you may also get a percentile. So let's think about how to interpret this score. So in general, you want those lowest numbers, and the lowest number, the better. Often the K awards are funded somewhere between 20 or 30, depending on the or less, depending on the institute. So getting scores in the 1s or 2 ranges, or 10 and 20 ranges, are really good. 20 to 30 are borderline in most cases, depending on, again, the year. And those highest scores mean there's a lot of enthusiasm with minimal weaknesses. On the other hand, 4, 5s, and 6s means there's just moderate enthusiasm, and there may be, more than trivial weaknesses, but often that are remedial. And so there's definitely, don't be too discouraged by the 4, 5s, or even 6s, because it does mean that you can come back. Now, 7, 8s, and 9s are really given, but it usually means there's some fatal flaws or some real problems with the application. So in thinking about your scores, think about a couple of things. One is, again, why you may not have gotten a good score as a candidate. Often it relates to productivity. Maybe you came in too early. You haven't had a good chance to publish yet. You may need to just explain, how much clinical work you did, or how early you are, what papers you have in the pipeline. Or you could also be dinged rather, for not needing the proposed training. They may think you're too advanced for a career development award. Then the career development plan could be dinged from multiple areas. Not a clear path for independence. Are you really charting out a path that's different than your mentor? Do you have the right balance between didactics, research, and mentored experiences? And is your career development plan really aligned with the research you're proposing and that point in your career? Again, the research plan, are there problems with the science? Is it, is it the appropriate science, and is it feasible science given where you're at? Again, mentors could be dinged about their qualifications, their commitment, their experiences. And again, we talked about the environment, the institutional commitment, and that a weak letter from your department chair can actually be near fatal. So after you will get something called a summary statement. It will give you the overall impact score, if it's our grant, also a percentile. And what's key is if your grant is discussed, you'll get a summary of that discussion. And that's often maybe written by either, depending on the study section, the primary reviewer or the chair of the study section. And that will give you a sense of what really was discussed, not only written, but discussed. So I would read that very, very closely. It will also have your abstract that you wrote and the detailed 3 critiques with each of the criterion and the scores for each of the criterion. And they'll also comment on the other areas like human subjects and budget and so forth. So that's what you'll see. If you have a fundable score, again, or once something's been scored, it will be discussed at various levels of the NIH, including something called council, your project offices, and based on your score and other funding availability, a funding decision will be made. So what next? First of all, if it doesn't appear competitive, don't worry. It's happened to all of us. I have more poorly scored than well-scored applications, but I've been able to have a robust research career. We all learn from our critiques and we make them better. Sometimes you need to just step away, read the critiques and the summary score, when you're in a calm, good state of mind. If you weren't scored, you really have to decide why there was such a lack of enthusiasm. Was there just one fatal flaw, like a poor letter from your chair, or a lack of some key detail, or do they really not like the idea? And again, you want to think carefully and consult with your mentor about whether those are fixable, and then develop a plan for resubmission. And this last slide is courtesy of Tika Hall. I wanted to express my gratitude because I think she's one of the most unwavering supporters of trainees. And she just wants, she has reminded us all to be prepared for all possible outcomes, marshal your resources, identify your mentors, your collaborators, your peers, who will really, your family, who can all help you kind of orient your approach if need be. And remember, although the outcomes are important, don't take it personally. We all get rejections or get critiques, and it's part of our career, and we just hope to continue to learn. So thank you very much, and I hope to talk to you later.